Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on three new books on the history of the Vietnam Wars by Christopher Goscha, author of The Road to Dien Bien Phu, A History of the First Vietnam War for Vietnam, Sean Mchale, the author of The First Vietnam War, Violence, Sovereignty, and the Fracture of the South, 1945 to 1956, and George J. Veit, Drawn Swords in a Distant Land, South Vietnam's Shattered Dreams. I'm also happy to welcome Katie Edwards of Tulane University as our moderator this afternoon. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague, Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. Behind the scenes are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And we'd like to thank our various supporters, and as always, we invite you to join their ranks. Information on how to do so can be found in the chat column. On the logistics front, please note today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I turn the screen over to Christian Osterman, who will continue the introduction. Christian.
Thanks so much, Eric. Welcome, everyone. This will be an unusual format for the Washington History Seminar, at least for those who regularly join us on Monday afternoons. We will be discussing. Hold on. Alexa, stop. Something got my Alexa going. Apologies. It will be an unusual format, and in that we're discussing three books, having a conversation about three books this afternoon, three important new books, three important big new books on the Vietnam Wars. And we are delighted to welcome Katie Edwards as our co-moderator for this session. So all of you, as I've just told our panelists, are guinea pigs for a new type of Washington History Seminar we're trying out. Let me introduce Katie, who will run the second part of the seminar. After some initial overviews over the books, Katie will help co-moderate a roundtable discussion here before we then go to audience questions and comments. Katie is an associate professor at Tulane University and received her PhD in 2010 from the University of Toronto. Dr. Edwards specializes in contemporary France and the Second Overseas Empire with a strong interest in historical remembrance. Her book, Contesting Indochina, French Remembrance Between Decolonization and the Cold War, published in 2016, examines the French memory of the Indochina War, 1945 to 54, by considering film, monuments, and commemorative practices, veterans organizations, and special interest groups. Her current research examines colonial reform during the era of the left-wing Popular Front government in the mid to late 1930s. Welcome, Katie, to the Washington History Seminar. Let me give you the floor for just a moment before I introduce Chris.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thanks to you, Christian, and to Eric for inviting me to be part of this. And a big thanks goes to all three authors who provided such excellent, thought-provoking works to read, which was a wonderful way to wrap up the academic year for me.
Thank you. With that, let me introduce our first speaker, Christopher Goscha. He's a professor of history at the University of Quebec at Montreal. He has spent much of his adult life studying the people, politics, and history of Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. He studied at Georgetown University and then at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, La Sorbonne. He has written extensively about the many different regions of Indochina and on the wars for Vietnam. His recent publications include The Penguin History of Modern Vietnam, and of course, The Road to Dien Bien Phu, The History of the First Indochina War, published by Princeton earlier this year, the book about which you will speak to us here today. Chris, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Christian. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for the Washington History Seminar, for putting this together. It's a real privilege and an honor for me to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and put a little PowerPoint up here just by way of introduction. I hope that everyone can see it. So you have, hang on, I'm just going to enlarge the screen here. 1 second, there we go. What I'd like to do in about 10, maybe 13 or 14 minutes is just to give you kind of a basic overview of the book. Not all of the book, but I would say the second half of The Road to Dien Bien Phu, a history of the First War for Vietnam, which you can see here, the cover 1945 to 1954. Hang on, I'm having a little bit of trouble. There we go. So I'm gonna give you a little presentation of one of the main arguments of my book, which tries to explain how the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and his Communist Party, were able to bring down the French army, conventional professional army in Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954. If you look here, just to situate you, you have the Siege of Dien Bien Phu. Most people, I think most of the audience is familiar with this. It's one of the biggest battles of the 20th century. It's not as big as maybe the First and Second World Wars, but it definitely ranks up there as one of the epic battles, conventional battles of the 20th century. So you have on the left-hand side, you have Vietnam in its S shape, Laos on the left-hand side, and Cambodia, which formed French Indochina, which existed from about 1887 until 1954, when it came down at Dien Bien Phu and was divided into two halves, at least Vietnam was, at the Geneva Conference a couple months after the Vietnamese victory at Dien Bien Phu. If you look at the colors here, you have in a kind of a deeper brown, and then it goes to a lighter brown, the expansion of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam between, I would say, October of 1950 and the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May of when the Vietnamese won on the 7th of May of 1954. You can see that the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was concentrated in the north and in the center, and a little bit in the south here, as you can see in this zone right here. I'll come back to that a little bit later. On the right-hand side, you have Dien Bien Phu, where the battle occurred for about 60 days, 2 months, as two armies went up against each other. Here, just to situate you a little bit, we have a famous photo showing the Vietnamese army as it attacks the French positions in the valley of Dien Bien Phu in northwestern Vietnam. So they're attacking, as you can see, there's artillery barrages going on, as the troops themselves, professional troops, go over the top to attack the trenches and the machine gun nests on the other side. Here we have trenches. This was a battle, unlike any other battle of decolonization that was fought during the 20th century. I'll get back to that in a moment. But here you have the French army that had to dig in. They had to dig in because they were throwing artillery at the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese were throwing artillery at them. Machine gun fire was going on. So this is a famous photo showing French Vietnamese, the allies of the French, North African troops as well, who are in the trenches here, trying to hold off the Vietnamese as they attacked during those 2 months. This is after the battle ended on the 7th of May. It has been cleaned up, as you can see here. But again, you can understand that this is a very specific type of battle, a conventional battle. This is trench warfare, what I call Dien Bien Phu entrenched. Many French officers who had been around for the First World War compared it to Verdun. And you can see why here at this, thanks to this picture that you have here of Dien Bien Phu, a couple months after. Now, if you look here, this was after the battle. Of course, this was on the front pages of all the French newspapers, the New York Times as well. You have the Figaro on the left. You have the French Communist Party, L'Humanité, on the right, upper right-hand corner. You have Le Monde here. But what's interesting is you have the Echo d'Oran. And you can see that the French settler community in Algeria was closely following what was going on in Indochina, because once, as you well know, once Dien Bien Phu fell, the French would pull out of Indochina. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but then they would turn to the second half of what I call the long Indo-North African War that the French would fight between 1945 and 1962. In other words, in November of 1954, you have the start of the Algerian War. The reason I mention that is that this member of the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN, the National Liberation Front that was fighting the French in Algeria. Frantz Fanon, he was also a famous philosopher, a famous intellectual, a famous person who reflected on decolonization. Frantz Fanon, he wrote The Wretched of the Earth, and this is what he wrote in 1961. And the reason I cite this is because this really is the reason why I wrote the book. I wanted to answer the question which Frantz Fanon posed right here. I'm not going to read this excerpt right here. I would invite you to do so, but it's the underlying parts, obviously, that interest me. What must be done to bring about another Dien Bien Phu? So you had many nationalists across the world, but in particular in Algeria, who were watching very closely what was going on elsewhere in the French Empire. And they wanted to know how the Vietnamese, how Ho Chi Minh pulled off Dien Bien Phu. How can we manage it? The only problem was how best to use the forces at their disposal, how to organize them, and when to bring them into action. Frantz Fanon, as you know, was quite interested in trying to find ways to create revolutionary violence that could bring down the colonizer. What's interesting is that he cites Dien Bien Phu, and he cites it in other places in the book that you see here on the left as well, The Wretched of the Earth. So this is one of the key questions at the heart of my book is how did the Vietnamese do this? How did they pull off a victory like none other in the history of decolonization in the 20th century? My answer to this question, and it's going to get us to the second argument in my book, the one I want to treat here, is how did they do this? How can we answer Frantz Fanon? And I think we have to return to the past. We have to understand the state that the Vietnamese built and how they built it and how they did it in a time of war and how they used war to do it. So let me just situate you a little bit better with the birth of Vietnam, because Sean and Jay are going to be talking about this Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam that you see here, and then different Vietnams which are going to oppose themselves to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which Ho Chi Minh declared independent on the 2nd of September, 1945. He is a nationalist. He is a communist. He was at the head of the Indochinese Communist Party. It only had 5,000 members in September of 1945. So he had to create a coalition government, which you can see here, which consisted of non-communists. And there was more non-communists who were in the government, and they helped him run the different branches of the government that he created in September of 1945. On the right-hand side, you can see a stamp, the Ho Chi Minh government stamped on top of it, Vietnam, stamped on top of a colonial stamp, the words independence, freedom, and happiness in the name of Vietnam. The only problem is that just once the French nation state had been liberated by the Allies in 1944, Charles de Gaulle came to power, but Charles de Gaulle wanted to add the empire back to this newly liberated national state that he has in France. I won't go into the details, but Charles de Gaulle will send his men back to Indochina in a bid to recreate the colonial state which had existed before World War II. The Japanese had overthrown the French at the end of World War II. I won't get into that. I can answer questions if you like, or Sean and Jay can as well. My point here is that there was no negotiating. Some people disagree with what I said. We can talk about it later. There was no negotiating. The French weren't ready to decolonize, and the Vietnamese weren't ready to go back into the French Empire. They were to some extent, but not on the terms which the French proposed. War broke out in December of 1946, which forced Ho Chi Minh to go into the countryside, which he'll do, and he'll continue to run a guerrilla state, a state of war. It has a communist core, but it's going to carry on fighting guerrilla warfare, much like the FLN will do later in Algeria, much like the Mau Maus will do in Kenya, much like Indonesian Republicans will do against the Dutch in Indonesia at the same time as the Vietnamese are fighting the French here. So Ho Chi Minh, he runs a bureaucracy, he runs a state, he has a currency. He has a police service, he has an intelligence service, he puts together an army as well. You can see the army here that was created at the end of World War II. It will develop between 1945 and 1950. This is a very famous citation of Ho Chi Minh in 1946. I won't read it here, but I think it captures quite well in a global way what guerrilla warfare is and remains to in many ways to this very day. So my point here is during the first half of the Indochina War, Ho and his army were fighting a guerrilla warfare against a superior, better armed French elephant, if you like, a more modern army. Despite the French army's problems coming out of World War II itself, it was still in a better position than the Vietnamese one was here. I'm going a little bit fast here because I want to get to the second half of the Indochina War, and I want to really try to explain a revolution or two revolutions that occur that are really at the core of my book. I try to answer Frantz Fanon's question, how did the Vietnamese go beyond a guerrilla war? How did they turn a tiger into an elephant that was capable of bringing down the French elephant at Dien Bien Phu? And to understand that, you have to understand, as many of you know, is that the war changed profoundly in 1950. You know, after Mao Zedong came to power and created the People's Republic of China, run by the Chinese Communist Party. So this is a very important change in the Indochina War. Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh, that's later on in the 1960s. I know it's not a photo from the 1950s, but they knew each other from the 1930s. Ho Chi Minh had been a globetrotter in China, in France, in Russia as well. He was part of a Eurasian. One of the things I argue in my book is that there was an Eurasian communist arc, and Ho Chi Minh ran that arc from France to southern China, to Vietnam, by way of the Soviet Union, the Comintern, all sorts of things. My point is that Ho was a nationalist, he ran a coalition government, but he was also a communist, and it matters a lot. So I want to turn here to Fanon's question is, how did the Vietnamese change their state? How did they change the nature of the war? How did they change their army? How did they move towards Dien Bien Phu from 1950? No one in 1950 knew that they were going to be able to bring down the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. So what happened? I have to go a little bit quickly here. I don't want to take up too much time. First thing is that the Chinese were of immense help. They gave diplomatic recognition in January of 1950. They gave military assistance, not just low-level military assistance, but heavy arms. As limited as it may be, they were important. They changed the nature of the war. The Chinese sent delegations, two delegations in particular, the Chinese military delegation, a Chinese political advisory group as well. And I would say that they also sent specialists in communist mobilization techniques and in communist economic techniques as well. Oftentimes, we only think of the military half or maybe the political half. There's a lot going on in these Chinese military groups that were sent between 1950 and 1954. I won't go into it, but the man, you have Ho Chi Minh on the left here, the man on his right hit someone he knew from the 1920s. Many of the men whom Mao personally picked knew Ho Chi Minh, knew many of the Vietnamese who were fighting against the French from the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1940s. Again, they're part of this wider Eurasian revolutionary arc that I talk about in the book, which is crucial to understanding this hookup that occurs right here, this kind of nexus that happens when the Chinese come to power. So this is one thing that's very important. The Chinese military assistance group, advisors in different domains, not just the military domain. First, what do they do? Well, they are going to help the Vietnamese to operate a military revolution. With that military aid, you can see some of it right here. What else are they going to do? They're going to help the Vietnamese to create a professional army. That never happened during the Algerian War. It never happened during the Indonesian War either. It's not because they were less apt to do it. It's because the Vietnamese had a big help behind them. So by 1954, they had 7 divisions, 200,000 men. That matters. That's part of a military revolution that you can see in points 2 and 3, equipped with artillery, anti-aircraft batteries, and the like. There was also they decreed mass mobilization of the population. A law was passed. Military conscription was imposed, just like the Ukrainians did as well. And there was 8 conventional battles which occurred between 1950 and 1954. And behind this military revolution is an organized state coming out of 45 and 50, but is capable to take this in hand and to transform the army. So that's the second thing. It's a military, there's the Chinese military delegations, the political delegations, the economic delegations. It's the military revolution is the second thing. The third thing is a revolution in statecraft. It's the raising up of a single party communist state from the war, from the guerrilla war, thanks to this conjuncture of 1950. You can take a look at the points that I put out here. But the Communist Party, thanks to the Chinese aid, thanks to the war itself, will expand their control over the state. With assistance, advice, and models from the Chinese over the Viet Minh Nationalist Front, mass associations, they'll take in hand the core of the police service in the army. They will implement rectification sessions to create a loyal bureaucratic class to the party, who will be in charge of the police service, the intelligence services, the army, and the bureaucracy itself. Does that mean that everyone is converted to communism? No. Does that mean that they created a very elite and ever-growing bureaucratic class? Yes, very similar to what Mao Zedong did during the war against the Japanese between 1937 and 1945, and again during the Civil War between 1946 and 1949. If you look at point number 4, it's land reform. This is something that the Vietnamese borrowed directly from Mao, from Yan'an, from the Chinese war against the Japanese, and then the Civil War. Why? Because they could do two things with land reform. On the one hand, they could replace the landlords in the countryside, overwhelmingly peasant population, if you like, and replace them with cadres. That's what they started to do between 50 and 54. The second thing, by dividing up land and giving it to the peasants, they can mobilize peasants to enter into the army and to fight these conventional battles. Cult of personality was developed. Patriotic emulation campaigns were introduced by the Chinese through these delegations. Ho Chi Minh already knew about them from the 1920s and 30s in the Soviet Union and in China, but they step them up between 50 and 54 in order to mobilize people, to control people more, in order to organize this war, this conventional type of war that they were now fighting. It wasn't a guerrilla war. It was becoming something very different. This is the toolbox. This is the repertoire that they were developing from this Eurasian communist context, this corridor, and that they were applying now. As you know, in China, in Russia today, they still use the patriotic emulation campaigns, and in Vietnam to our days. They were introduced during the 50 to 54 period, even a little bit before, but stepped up during this second half of the war in order to mobilize for war and to increase the party's hold over the state, and therefore transform the state in a very, very revolutionary way. I won't go into details here, but they also took control of food production, banking, taxes, and finance. It's what I call a form of war communism in a time of decolonization. We only find this in Vietnam, in China, of course, in the Soviet Union, and in North Korea. A few of the tools, a few examples here, the cult of personality in the middle, emulation campaigns, which are organized, are organized around heroic model peasants, model women, model workers, anything with the hero of the heroes, who is Ho Chi Minh himself. This is 1952. A big Congress was organized by the Chinese and the Vietnamese with Ho Chi Minh. You can see my arrow right here in order to get the emulation campaigns going. And you have land reform on the bottom. Overthrow the landlords in order to put the cadres into power, the party integrator control, and mobilize the peasants so that they support the war. So these are the two, this argument that I'm making, the second big argument in the book is, it's here. It's about war communism. It's a Sino-Vietnamese Soviet form of war communism that was really honed by the Chinese and the Vietnamese between 1937 and 1954. And it refers to this process that started in 1950 when the Vietnamese communists used Soviet and Chinese communist advice, support, and models to intensify the war in conventional ways. And through this massive mobilization this required, they extended their control over the pre-existing coalition state to the detriment of their non-communist allies in their own ranks. This is something very different than what happened in the war of decolonization in Indochina or in Algeria or in anywhere else. Why? Because you have a communist state which is in control of this war. The communists are nationalist, but they are also communists with a very specific type of toolbox. It matters. Like the Chinese, the Vietnamese did not wait for the hostilities to end before using these instruments to push through the creation of a single party state. They used war to do it. This process of what I call war communism generated during the second half of the conflict what was, in effect, a slow burning coup d'etat of historic proportions from which the Vietnam we know today first emerged, a communist Vietnam with nationalist characteristics. This is also why, this is how the communist core with the Chinese and to a lesser extent the Soviets backing them were able to transform the tiger into an elephant that was capable, of winning conventional war, trench warfare, like we see here at Dien Bien Phu. This never occurred in Algeria, never in Indonesia or in Afghanistan. Dien Bien Phu only occurred in a time of decolonization in Vietnam. Again, it's not because the Algerians or the Indonesians or the Kenyans, for that matter, or anyone else was less nationalist. It doesn't have anything to do with that. They were as nationalist as the Vietnamese. It's the nature of the state. It's the nature of the animal, if you will allow me to put it that way, the state that was fighting the war. So the power of nationalism is real. I don't deny it, but it can shape outcomes, but it cannot alone explain Dien Bien Phu. I would end by saying something very similar is going on in Ukraine. I would never, ever say that the Ukrainians are not nationalists. They are nationalists. There is a general uprising, but it's very important to note as well that the Ukrainians have a professional divisional army backed up by the Americans in the same way that the man you see here, Ho Chi Minh, went to the Soviets and to the Chinese in particular during the Indochina War, asking for as much military aid, model, and help as he could in order to win the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. We'll go to our second speaker, Sean Mchale, who is an associate professor of history and international affairs at GW here in Washington, D.C., educated at Swarthmore, the University of Hawaii, and Cornell University. He's a specialist in Southeast Asian history. Among his publications are Print and Power, Confucianism, Communism, and Buddhism in the Making of Modern Vietnam, published in 2004, The First Vietnam War, Violence, and of course, The First Vietnam War, Violence, Sovereignty, and the Fracture of the South, 1945 to 1956, which he'll be speaking about today. I also want to note a recent publication in the Journal of Asian Studies on ethnicity, violence, and Khmer Vietnamese revelations, the significance of the lower Mekong Delta, 1757 to 1954. So Sean takes a long view as well. And with that, it's over to you for your presentation, Sean.
Thank you. The first thing I want to say after Chris's presentation is I've actually already, in a book review, said that I think his book is the single most important work in English on the period of the First Indochina War. And that being said, I also think that his book is particularly good for looking at the 2/3 of what is now Vietnam, the north and the center, and that the south is a place apart. And it has different dynamics, and therefore it's worth looking at, not only because it is different, but also for the simple reason that in the south is where a state of Vietnam, then a Republic of Vietnam emerged. So the question is sort of why. My very first time in Vietnam was, I remember one time I was walking down a street, and at that time, this is 1989, I'm walking down the street. Vietnam's one of the poorest countries in the world, and I happened to run into a monk who is an ethnic Khmer monk, and he sees me. He takes out a piece of paper, and he scribbles an address on it. He gives it to me, and he says, "You have to tell, actually, people outside Vietnam what is happening to us Khmer." And at that point, I had no idea what he was talking about. I honestly did not. But it clues us into a difference between the war in the north and the center and the south. That there are different ethnic groups. There's actually a different character to the war in the south, and that's one of the things that my book addresses. In fact, I would argue that my book is the first substantive work in English, based on French and Vietnamese sources, on the First Indochina War in the south of Vietnam. And it is an intervention in a long discussion about, sort of what happened in the south. And I think it's significant not just for understanding a period in history from 45, I'll go up to 56, but also understanding some of the characteristics of southern Vietnam from 1954 to 75, and indeed onwards. So this is why we need to understand, in a sense, this period. I use many sources never before been used. I went to archives in 2 archives in Vietnam, including the military archives, 1 archive in Vietnam, and 1 archive in Cambodia. And it gives an alternative to what I think of as the usual northern-centered account. In particular, one of the things I look at that's very important in the South is understanding the conflict as both a civil war and a war against the French, both together at the same time. It's a very complicated, in a sense, war. I focus heavily on the themes of violence, sovereignty, and institutional collapse and reconstruction. And finally, I'll just note that I make an argument which is sure to be controversial to some people. I argue that in the South, and I'm talking about the southern third of the country, the communists lost the war for that particular area. I try to actually substantiate this argument, which is a novel argument, and a lot of people are unsure whether or not they should agree with me on this one. But I will stick with my guns. But let me unpack some of what I'm saying to help you understand the book. If we look at people who write on the First Indochina War, there is a heavy focus on the North. The narrative is a northern-centered narrative. It begins often in 1945 with the rise of the Viet Minh and the seizure of Hanoi. And this narrative ends actually in the North with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And then, of course, the Geneva Accords, which confirm, in a sense, that France has lost and has to transfer power to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the North. The South, however, is a very different kind of place than the center or the North. The Civil War character of the conflict is most acute in the South, and particularly in the Mekong Delta. And the contestants are often different. And the story I told you about the Khmer monk is actually indicative of there's a Khmer minority in the South, and there is not one in the center or North. And this happens to be a very important fact. The contestants are different. There are more politico-religious sects which are reasonably well institutionalized in the South, and this does give it a very different character to the war. And of course, this is the area which turns out to be the core of the state of Vietnam, which then becomes the Republic of Vietnam. Which is in existence from 1954 to 1975. Now, to understand this war, what I do in the book really has, I would argue, two main sections. And the first section looks at only 2 years, looks from the summer of 1945 to the summer of 1947. And my interest in looking at that particular period is to examine what I call the double fracture, which is a very important argument that I make in the book. The first fracture is a violent split among ethnic Vietnamese. So you see the resistance, a resistance which had been sort of tenuously unified in the South in 1945. By 1947, this resistance, Vietnamese communist-led resistance, had fractured. Okay, so and fractured into a communist-led resistance, the remaining communist-led resistance, and then you have actually anti-communist and non-communist and others in this other sort of grouping. The second fracture is the ethnic fracturing between ethnic Vietnamese and ethnic Khmer. And although the Khmer are a minority, they are actually a very important minority in the Mekong Delta for the war. They actually contribute wildly disproportionate numbers of for example, militia members to the war effort. And they also have some of them articulate a sovereignty claim for the Mekong Delta. And all of this is one of the reasons why they eventually split with the Vietnamese. So that double fracture occurs. It basically has it occurs. And so by summer of 1947, the question is, okay, what's going to happen? Will the communist-led resistance, will it regroup? Will it learn from its mistakes? Will it then actually seize the initiative, as in the center and the north, and ultimately triumph, or not? And the story here is very interesting because it is a bit slow to the communist resistance is slow to sort of learn from its mistakes, and in the end, actually, they are not able to seize the initiative back and win the war for the South. One of the things I should just point out here is that the scholarship, the previous scholarship, has articulated the view that the French were extremely successful at divide and rule tactics among Vietnamese and Khmer in the South. I argue that is true, but what I argue is it's the dynamic of violence which is unleashed, which is primed and then unleashed in a 2-year period, which takes people who had actually tenuously collaborated with each other, and it drives them apart. And in this process, the communist leadership of the resistance is particularly important in sort of driving, in a sense, this violence forward. Now, so in 1947, it's fractured. And rather than provide a chronological account of what happens from 47 to 54, or actually I end in 56, I have thematic chapters, one on this massive level of migration in the South. It's surprising to me that more hasn't been written about migration in the Vietnam Wars. The importance of race and thinking through issues of race in the South. Again, this is an important issue, and I've come up with all sorts of material on that. Of course, the conflicts between a Vietnamese state and its military on the one hand, and a rising Vietnamese state. I make an argument which no one has made in the last 50, 60 years, that this actually rising Vietnamese state is actually more significant than the scholarship suggests. So I have a contrarian argument here, and I'm happy to argue about that one if people want to. And then, of course, I go downwards into the actual struggle, the conflict in the Mekong Delta among militias, self-defense forces, communist-led resistance, politico-religious groups, French and Vietnamese. This is a very complex struggle, but one of the things we have to remember about these wars for Vietnam is they are wars. Okay, they are conflicts. They were very bloody. I can't tell you what the death tolls are, but there were certain periods in this war which were just bloodbaths. I'll leave it at that. I also look at in the end, I look at the denouement of the war, which I actually date more or less from 1953 onwards in the South. By 1953, the communist-led resistance is on the ropes. It tries to make a comeback, but it can't actually do that. And what happens in the South ends up in a situation where the French are actually trying to transfer military and state power by 1954 to the Vietnamese, but in essence, the entire war has fractured the polity. Okay, so you end up with a situation in 1954 with a very fragmented political realm, but also a fragmented military. And in my view, although this wasn't the main point of my book, in my view, that fragmentation has a very deep impact on essentially what happens after 1954, including when we think about why the United States gets involved in the war, which is a cast of characters who have coup after coup against one another, military generals, and this is the kind of state which is falling apart. It is not a unified state. And that state actually has its origins in a sense, the war that happened from 1954 onwards. And beyond actually that particular period, there are certain divisions in Vietnam today which you can easily trace back to this earlier period. The Hoa Hao Buddhists, for example, who still are often anti-government, and the Cao Dai religious group as well, which as well has suffered under the communists, and we see a process whereby the Vietnamese state today is trying to reach out to these groups and try in some way to minimize these differences. But it's even in 2022, there are difficult relationships sometimes between these different groups, and they trace back to this foundational moment, the First Indochina War. And I'll end there.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean. Now to our third speaker, George J. White, who is the author of Black April, The Fall of South Vietnam, 1973 to 1975, published in 2012. Codename Bright Light, The Untold Story of U.S. POW Rescue Efforts During the Vietnam War, published in 1998. And Leave No Man Behind, Bill Bell and the Search for American POW MIAs from the Vietnam War, published in 2004. He's written extensively on the Vietnam War, spoken at many conferences, testified on the POW MIA issue before Congress. He is the author of a recent Sources and Methods blog post from the History and Public Policy program on the Anna Chenot affair, the South Vietnamese side of the war's greatest conspiracy theory. His fourth book is a political, social, and economic history of the rise and fall of South Vietnam, Drawn Swords in a Distant Land, South Vietnam's Shattered Dreams, published last year by Encounter Books. He recently completed his PhD at Monash University and lives in Delaware. George, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. Floor is yours.
Thank you. How much time do we have? Just a quick time check.
About 10 minutes or so.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. So again, thank you. I'll mimic Chris's points. Thank you for having me. I wanted to just quickly summarize my book for you guys. Really, it's an attempt to outline the political, social, economic, and diplomatic achievements and failures of what came after President Diem. And so there's two particular periods after the coup of 63. There's the 4-year interregnum, 63 to 67, and then the formation of the Second Republic in 67 to the fall of the country in April of 75. So if there's anything you remember about my speech, it is this. And I tried to focus on what I have termed, just as Chris has termed the phrase war communism. I am putting forth that South Vietnam was attempting to what I call build and fight at the same time. So much has been written about the communist tactic of talking while fighting, which is an effort to use military force to achieve a dramatic outcome at a negotiating table. South Vietnam is attempting to build their country while fighting the war at the same time. What does that mean? They're essentially trying to move from a military dictatorship to a constitutional government, turn landless and impoverished peasants into an ownership society, restructure the country's economic system to embrace a market-oriented system, establish the rule of law, and enhance its own civil society. And they're all doing it at the same time while fighting an implacable enemy that's going to use those very attributes against it. So ultimately, of course, South Vietnam failed at doing this, as did Afghanistan, and to a lesser extent, Iraq. So let's take it back to the beginning. So the coup against Diem was driven not by the U.S., but by the South Vietnamese generals who thought two things. One, Diem's despotic rule was losing the people and hence losing the war, but they were also had this deep-seated fear that Diem and New were considering neutrality as a means to end the war. And to the South Vietnamese generals, neutrality was just a way of opening the floodgates to a communist takeover. And so that is one of the reasons why General Minh led the coup. And so after the coup, something very different happens in South Vietnamese politics. Diem himself and New were very much top-driven, what we call micromanagement, whereas Minh tried to do something different. He tried to reach out to what he thought were the disaffected segments of South Vietnamese society. As Dr. Mchale mentioned, the Cao Dai, the Wow, the sects. And he was trying to build a new coalition of nationalist elements, pull what he thought were the non-communist elements away from the NLF, leaving the communists isolated. And that would then create a new South Vietnam that was far more inclusive. Now, in January of 1964, Win Con leads a coup that overthrows Big Min and his government. Well, one of the things I discovered in the writing of my book is that the coup was not led by Win Con. He was pretty much a figurehead, but it was really a sort of a Dien Bien Phu, which is one of the political parties of South Vietnam, secretly driven coup because they were afraid of the same thing that had led to the overthrow of Diem. The Tran Van Dam, two of the main conspirators, Le Van Kim and General Tran Van Dam, were leading the South Vietnamese towards a neutrality stance, which they were not. So Con is a disaster, and by about October of '64, the South Vietnamese military decides they're going to try and reinstate civilian leadership to sort of fix their problems. And there was two different civilian governments, both of which failed for various reasons. So by June of '65, Win Cao Ki and Win Van Thieu take over. Now, both of these men help right the ship by good leadership, but they also, of course, had the introduction of U.S. combat troops, which stabilizes the military situation and allows them to begin to launch new programs to stabilize the South Vietnamese government. And those programs included beginning to revitalize pacification, creating a rural development cadre program where they would send trained Vietnamese cadre down into the villages to help enhance government programs. They were also attempting economic reforms, such as devaluating the piastre and a few other things. So they were trying to do all this thing, but the main thing that they were trying to do was they were trying to reinstate a civilian government, and they were trying to do that through a constitutional government. And one of the things I discovered in writing the book was that Win Cao Ki and Thieu in particular, were driving this train far more than people realized. And although there were some hiccups along the way and some back and forth, it was Thieu and Ki who sort of ramrod this constitution through some generals who were not thrilled about it. And this leads to the presidential election, September of '67, and the institution of the Second Republic. So now we've got a Second Republic. Thieu was elected president, and all of a sudden the Tet Offensive hits in January of '68. And they managed to weather that, and they managed to weather the second attack in May. But the heavy enemy casualties allow the Allies, both the U.S. and the South Vietnamese, to sort of counterattack, to go back and push deeper, much deeper into the countryside than they had ever been before. And as the communists are in vast retreat, it allows Thieu to create the first of his three most signature programs, which I will discuss here. The first one he made was called the People's Self-Defense Force. It began in August of '68, and it was in essence designed to do two things. He was physically giving arms and some training to the villagers to defend themselves against communist attacks. To think about it this way, South Vietnam has always been caricatured as this military dictatorship. It was an illegitimate government. Most people didn't like it. Yet here we have, over time, almost 1 million weapons giving out, almost 4 million people involved in the People's Self-Defense Force. And these people did not turn the weapons against the government, nor did they turn the weapons over to the Viet Cong. There was ever, to my mind, a telling commentary on whether the people thought the government was legitimate or at least, sufferable. That's it. The second thing that Thieu did was, by March of 1970, he launches what's called the Land of the Tiller Law. And this is one of the most revolutionary programs in the history of South Vietnam and the history of the world. He basically attempted over a 3-year period to hand out hundreds of thousands of acres to hundreds of thousands of formerly landless peasants. But the reason why this program succeeded as wildly as it did was not just because they're handing out land titles to people. There's a lot more to it than that. At the same time, they were bringing in miracle rice. They were bringing in mechanical tools to help do a bunch of things. And then they also built a banking system. And then the third thing they did was they redesigned the economic system to lower inflation. I'm going to quickly skip through a couple things. 71 hits, two major events then sort of begin the end of South Vietnam. The failed 1971 invasion of Laos convinces Hanoi that their army has recovered its strength. The Americans are withdrawing. Now's the time to attack, which they launched the 1972 Easter Offensive. And then the one-man election, which destroys whatever legitimacy Thieu still had left. So by 72, the 72 offensive happens, and because of the early setbacks of the Arvin, Thieu then launches, he sort of eviscerates all sort of civil society. He rams through a bill to the Senate to give himself decree power, which he does the political power law, political party law, does the press law, the Democracy Party, all designed to eventually hold and win an election against the communists in South Vietnam. By 73, the Americans out, the Paris Peace Accord has been signed. The economy has turned into a depression because of the devastation from the 72 offensive, which then again convinces Hanoi to launch the 75 offensive. And at this time, as I said, the Politburo was finally right for all the wrong reasons. So again, I was trying to go very quickly over a 500-page book, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Jay. Sorry to be rushing you, as well as the others, through what are some really big books. Now over to Katie to get the three authors into a conversation. I think actually there's a lot of synergy here. So Katie, over to you.
Thanks very much. Actually, I wanted to start with a very broad question, perhaps, but that I think you've all three set up perfectly with your presentations. The questions of state formation and sovereignty are obviously key to all three of your works. I mean, they're central to all three. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit further. I think all of you in your presentations have addressed the question of state formation. And Sean, I know the questions of even para-state formation come up in your work. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how your work makes us or prompts us to rethink questions of state formation, particularly in times of significant division and conflict, but also to address the question of sovereignty, and not just sort of claiming sovereignty, because both states obviously claimed sovereignty, but how do they seek to really establish that sovereignty?
Can I go first on that one?
Absolutely.
So to Dr. Mchale's earlier point about how fractured South Vietnamese society was, and that was the key issue after the Diem coup. So once sort of the iron lid that Diem's rule had been taken off, all the things that had always been bedeviling South Vietnamese society, religious animosities, ethnic animosities, northern regional animosities, all exploded. And I think to a certain extent, they sort of stumbled their way through it, especially the Buddhist crisis in ’66, by not bringing the heavy hand down until they had sort of set the stage, as you said. So by '67, when there was a couple of elections had been held, sort of the hot cauldron of these divisions had sort of cooled a little bit, and they never really sort of resurrected themselves in terms of street protests the rest of the war. So in that sense, South Vietnam sort of took a different approach than other authoritarian countries. They didn't try to immediately send in the police and start beating protesters. They took a different approach, and I think ultimately sort of stumbled their way through finding a sort of a peaceful modus operandi between these groups.
If I may intervene, I think that the issue of sovereignty is actually a really an interesting and important one. In my book, what I do is one of the issues we have to face is that often people, when talking about sovereignty, associate it with a central state and what it claims over, in a sense, a country or area. And one of the difficulties about looking at a country in the midst of a war is that you have sovereignty claims by a central state that often don't match de facto the reality on the ground. And so that you have this process of working through what people have often called de facto sovereignty. How is it that on the ground you have people carving out spaces for themselves? And it can be a parastate, it can be a militia, or it can be a central government. But they're all working to work this process out. And I talk a lot about that actually in my book, because I think this often gap between central state claims on the one hand, whether it's a French state or Vietnamese state, and local realities is a very important dynamic that we have to understand. And the only way to understand that really, as I said, is to go down to the local level and see how these things work out. And in the end, what happens is, Vietnam is fractured precisely because many, in the First Indochina War, because of the many different claims people are making and actually asserting in local areas, which makes it hard to pull together, in a sense, a unified country with a unified territory.
Yeah, I'll piggyback in there. I focused in on one of two of my big arguments in my presentation. Of course, the other one is that I make for the whole Indochina War is that sovereignty was shattered despite the consolidation of the single party state, which accelerated from 1950 to 1954. But 1954 is not 1945 or 1946. And so, yeah, like my colleagues, I go into depth about what I call the archipelago state, and it's a shattered state of islands, and it's Hanoi until 46, but then the capital is in northern Vietnam, tries to hold this big archipelago together. They make claims to all of Vietnam, but of course they don't control territorially all of Vietnam. So you have three states at war in one way or the other. On the one hand, of course, it's the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. On the other hand, it's the French Federation. It's the French colonial federation, which is allied with a second Vietnamese state, the Associated State of Vietnam, which is competing for all of Vietnam with the French against the DRV until 1954, when it will eventually gain its full independence and become the Republic of Vietnam in the South. But it's an interlacing and interconnecting battle of sovereignties for territorial control. So in my chapters on the archipelago state, I have one on the bureaucratic war of civil servants. I have one on radios and communications and how those allow the central state to at least try to consolidate its control. I have another one on the postal system, and I have a chapter as well on the policing, these type of things. So, yeah, your question, Katie, is right. I totally agree with Jay and with Sean. And sovereignty is key, and it's not just for Vietnam; it's for all other sorts of places. I think what's going on, sovereignty's been shattered in Ukraine, and I'm sure that the Ukrainians are doing not only the military things about which I've spoken, but they've got their communication systems, all sorts of things that I talk about. I think in my book, trying to link together. They have a claim to all of Ukraine. Of course, they don't control it all. So sovereignty shatter in war. That's what wars do.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. I also had a few questions trying to think about sort of the legacies of the First Indochina War for the Second Indochina War, and that connect, again, all three of your works. And I have sort of two directions that I'd like to take here. The first maybe is a question a little bit more for Sean and Jay, although, Chris, of course, you're welcome to weigh in. And that is thinking about the sort of the double fracture that Sean discusses and examines in the Mekong Delta in 45 to 54. What sorts of legacy does that have, or what sort of impact does that have on shaping the subsequent Republic of Vietnam? So we can think about this politically, we can think about it militarily, but how can we connect sort of those two situations in the South?
Yeah, the double fractures I've tried to argue, I think, is foundational, not just for the First Indochina War, but for later in the South. And what's interesting is when we think through what are some of the legacies that first may seem peculiar when we move forward into say looking at the American part of the war. And there are things like, to give an example, there are the United States Special Forces work with the Khmer Krom. And you say, well, where's that come from? Well, actually, this is one of the legacies, I believe, of that earlier war. In essence, the Americans are like the French. They're this patron, this outside patron who helps them. Or if you think about the issues having to do with both the Cao Dai religious group and the Hua Hao, in both cases, there are issues that go back to this earlier period, which shape actually the countryside. And there are many places where, for example, the South Vietnamese state after 1965, it claims sovereignty over certain areas. It has de facto. It certainly has some influence in those areas. But there are certain areas where, for example, which are Hua Hao, and basically they try to do as they want to do. They set up their own university. They do various things on their own. And so we have to think through. We have to think these are not oddities. These are actually this desire for some sort of autonomy comes from somewhere. And I would argue it goes back to this earlier period.
And Jay, would you like to comment?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have anything brilliant to add to Dr. Mchale's commentary, mainly because I'm so focused usually on sort of the after ZM period. So I'll have to pass on this one. Sorry.
And Chris, any thoughts?
On the continuity between the First Indochina War and the Second?
Yeah, I have another question that maybe I can set you up to begin with, and not just general continuities. I mean, there are plenty of them, but I'm wondering. I had originally wondered if you had any thoughts about sort of the continuity specifically in the Mekong Delta in the South between the fractures of the First Indochina War and then the fractures of under the Republic of Vietnam. But if you would like to address a different question, that's also fine. I'm also thinking about how that period from 45 to 54 shaped or impacted the DRV's war against the United States and against its American allies. So yeah, I will open the floor to you perhaps to start, and if the others would like to join in, they can do so.
Yeah, I would say that, I presented one half of my argument in the PowerPoint presentation. I just spoke on the second big argument in the book on the archipelago one. To pick up on the archipelago one, I think you have to keep in mind is that my presentation gives the idea that it was kind of a northern war. I think it's a collection of wars. The Indochina War is a collection of wars. It's a collection of contesting over territories in the north. Then I think a lot of people forget that the Indochina War was also territorial contesting in areas south of Hanoi and north of Hue, very violently contested areas there. That zone remained in the DRV's hands from 45 to 54. And then this is where Sean and I differ a little bit. I agree with him about the Mekong Delta. He's right. The DRV was very weak there. But there was also a zone below the 17th parallel. It was called Zone 5, which also the DRV was able to control. But again, these areas, and then there was even one in the further south in what's called Zone 9. I won't bring up the map. My point here is that it's a collection of wars, which the central state is trying to run, but really they've got radios, they have postal service, but it's hard. It's very, very difficult to do it. So it's fragmented. It's fragmented as well. And that's important. Second point I would make maybe to your second question is that zone below the 17th parallel is South Vietnam. I just want to make that point. That zone was controlled by the DRV, and the Diem brothers know it, and they know it well. That's where they were from, and they knew what the Vietnamese communists were doing there. My point is that, yes, the DRV / communists / nationalists were weak in the Mekong Delta, but they knew that upper half of South Vietnam like the back of their hands. And they knew what they were doing when they went back in after 1954. My point here, last point, third one, is that they resurrected the archipelago state, but they were able to link it to a consolidating state, which they had pushed southwards with military force from 1950 to 1954. They had to give up that spot at Geneva. And Pham Van Dom is from that zone, that northern half of South Vietnam, what would become South Vietnam. That was a huge concession that the DRV made at Geneva. And so they knew they knew South Vietnam very well, and they knew that lower tip. Even if they were weak, I agree with Sean. He's right. I think he knows that we both agree. But that allowed them to do very interesting things from 1959 when they resurrected their weak but useful archipelago state.
I'll add something, which is here about. I mean, I take pains in my book to say that I'm talking about the southern third of the country, what used to be called Cochinchina.
I agree.
And so, calling it the South when South Vietnam only came into existence after 1954. I'm not really concerned with that. What I do think we have to understand, though, is that what's interesting about the South is often the communist-led resistance makes its first mistakes in the South. And the communists are they're very good at learning from their mistakes. And a lot of those mistakes happen in the South. So, for example, their excessive militarization of the war, which first kind of arises, I think, well, I don't know what first arises in the South. I would argue it first arises in the South. They come to realize that they really need to focus more on politics. Their first attempt to shift to conventional warfare, it happens, a major shift to conventional warfare happens in the South, as Chris knows, because he's written about this. That's a giant failure. And they learn from that failure. So there are a lot of, in a sense, there are these connections between the South and the North, which are very important for the North and the center. But in the end, the communists in the South face a very important problem, and I think it's a problem which goes on and it shapes actually the war, the Second Indochina War, which is in the First Indochina War, there just aren't lots of people who join the Communist Party in the South. It's the weakest communist implantation of any part of Vietnam by far. And this is something which the communist-led resistance and then the DRV will have to sort of address. They'll have to figure out a way, in a sense, of getting around the fact that the Southerners just weren't terribly excited about joining a communist resistance. And they learn from that. They figure out a way. They set up a front, the National Liberation Front. And that's one of the ways in which they try to address this issue. I don't know if I'm going off topic here, but I do want to, I guess I just want to make those comments.
Great, thank you. And Jay, do you have thoughts about the sort of continuities between the First Indochina War? And I know that your period is really, your work focuses on the Republic of Vietnam, on the military, diplomatic, political structures, but I wonder if you might have some thoughts as well. And I think you're muted.
Sorry, thank you for winning. Yeah, no, I think one of the key traits here is the communists took the lessons that they had learned and applied in the North and how they won, and they tried to apply them in the South with varying degrees of success. They tried to convince the population to swing. I mean, it was very important to them, what they call proselytizing, to swing the population over to them, to send cadres down. But ultimately, I think they had to turn to the hammer. They failed in swinging the population to their side, and they had to turn to main force units to win the war. It was a tank that went through Independence Palace, not a crowd of protesters. So I think ultimately you'll see some of the things that Chris pointed out, and the lessons that they used applied again in the 65, 75 timeframe with varying degrees of success.
Can I just add something real quick?
Of course.
I think the hammer was used in central and northern DRV areas as well, and that the military did indeed spread the control, and increasingly from 1950 the control of the single party communist state through military power. And so that was one of the things which allowed them to consolidate their hold over the archipelago as they moved southward into that Zone 5, where they were going to have at the end of the war, as Jay knows and people who are specialists of the Vietnam War know, the 325th Division. I mean, a division is serious stuff, as everybody knows, both logistically, but also in terms of what a division can do. But it was in the Central Highlands, and it was involved in the last battle of the Indochina War in 1954, Street Without Joy, as Bernard Fall referred to it. But this was also the division that's going to hit the Americans hard at Yên Giang in 1965.
And to your point, Chris, people forget or aren't aware is that the 325th Division, which is seen as a Northern People's Army division,
right,
was actually raised in Quang Tri. It was a Quang Tri province, so people always forget that.
But that's South Vietnam. And I agree with what Sean said. Sean and I agree. I'm just saying is that the upper half of the Republic of Vietnam was administered during the Indochina War by I'm exaggerating a little bit. The lowlands of the upper half of southern Vietnam below the 17th parallel was run by the Democratic Republic of Vietnam until June of 1954, or even a little bit later.
Well, they continued that process all the way to the end.
Exactly. And that's why that zone was so important. And I'm getting back to Katie's question, is that there are some very serious continuities on both sides, on all sides, between this. I'll stop there. I don't want to go overboard on that.
Katie, go ahead.
Sure. I do want to leave some time for audience questions, but I would be remiss as a practicing historian if I did not ask you to comment perhaps on your sources a little bit, given that, questions of access, particularly some of the Vietnamese archives, access can be an issue. But also, Sean, you mentioned that you did research on 3 continents, and Jay, you also address the issue of archives at the very beginning of your book. So I'm wondering if the 3 of you could speak a little bit to the sources you used, the challenges you faced, what you have access to, what you don't have access to. And Sean, perhaps we could start with you.
Yeah, this is a fascinating question. I'll give a little anecdote. I was once when I was doing work in the Vietnamese archives, I was once told that, and I'm doing work on the First Indochina War. I was told, well, we don't want you to look at material on ethnic conflict, on religious conflict, or even on any issue relating to borders. Well, okay. It so turned out that, so you would think I can't do any research on the First Indochina War because it involves all of these issues. But luckily, the archivists didn't always pay attention. And I could find in Vietnam, I would say, okay, I'm going to look at for example, I want some material on Châu Đốc province, one province in southern Vietnam. And so, oh, okay, that seems good. And they gave me the entire file. The same material is in there. You just have to be careful at pushing for this kind of material. The other issue I'll say is, I use both French and Vietnamese sources, and the French military archives are really full of material that's either some of which is in Vietnamese, some of which is a lot of which is translated into French. But there's that material, and Chris has used that extensively. But there's also in South Vietnam, there are all sorts of on the one hand, there's this provincial sort of material which has never been used actually for this period, which astonished me. But then also, what I want to do when I wrote my books, I wanted to dig in. I wanted to get primary sources and memoirs. I didn't want to just use a lot of secondary sources, and so I read Vietnamese memoirs, for example, and indeed, when we look at the totality of the kinds of works I dug up, a lot of it has never been used before, and Chris has the same experience. So that new material does provide new interpretations, new perspectives on these wars.
I'll jump in maybe. I used Vietnamese and French sources. I had a harder time getting into the archives in Vietnam when I wanted to go. I want to go back and try. So Sean did a much better job, as have others who may be in the audience, did a much better job of working in the Vietnamese archives than I did. Another reason that another source that I found in Vietnam, though, was what's called the Resistance Collection. It's held at the National Library. And basically, it's just masses of the publications of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam between 1945 and 54, but also between 50 and 54 in particular, which provided me some of the stuff that I needed to get into that toolbox I talked about in my presentation. So weaker on the archival side, but the sources that I had did come from the Vietnamese state as well. And it's very, very rich. And I urge people perhaps listening to look at that. I put my notes online on my home site, kind of a finding guide to help you. And then the French archives too, second source, and memoirs like Sean, Vietnamese memoirs, whether they're communist and in particular non-communist ones. I think that's something I didn't bring up, but it's maybe the third argument, is that there's a coalition state. And the DRV is a coalition state until 1950, and to some extent until the end in central and southern Vietnam, of course. But I wanted to use sources from the French side, memoirs from non-communist Vietnamese, to understand what it meant to live in the archipelago, what it meant to live in the borderlands, what it meant. Like Sean, I talk about the mind-boggling violence the French let loose, which is maybe the fourth thing I talk about in my book. It's just god-awful violence. And I wanted to understand how civilians survived that and didn't. So those were the sources in a nutshell that I used to get at the different levels of this archipelago come single party state that I talk about in my book, The Road to Dien Bien Phu.
I'm no different there too. I use a combination of US, Vietnamese, and French materials, although I was focused on the French Foreign Ministry materials, not the military stuff. Much like Sean, I dove extremely deep, searched far and wide for every Vietnamese nationalist memoir I could possibly get my hands on to understand sort of their perspective, what they were thinking, what they were really going on, and not rely solely on U.S. Sources telling people what they think the Vietnamese are thinking. And then there's some documents from the Vietnamese side. There was a combination of documents from the archive, documents that were still in private hands, documents from the time frame that were translated into English. And so I was drowning in documents, but I was able to take all those and try to sort of weave together sort of the story as best I could, trying to give it, in essence, from a Saigon level view of what was happening, how they were trying to build and fight at the same time, build their country. If I can just say one quick thing to the general named Paul Van Uxem, who Chris Miller will know. His family, he's long dead, his family gave me access to his archives. And in the archives, there was a report from 1952 of a second lieutenant, Nguyen Van Chu, who had gone to a class in Hanoi. And there was a tiny little picture of Chu attached to the thing, which I included in the book. It was for a researcher, it's the find of it's a glorious find.
I want to just jump in and just kudos to Jay for folks out there. He's done some amazing interviews with South Vietnamese. Sometimes they weren't from the South, but non-communist people from the Republic of Vietnam, military folks, political folks as well. And he's used those quite effectively in his last book and the other one as well. And you've done a lot of interviews, and it deserves to be said.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to all three of you. Christian, I will turn it over to you perhaps and to audience Q&A.
Sure. Thank you. What a great discussion. And, feel free, Katie, to chime in as well. But let's take a couple of audience questions. Let's go to David Anderson. David Anderson, if I think you've raised your hand. There you go. Please unmute yourself. And yes, ask your question, please.
Am I unmuted? Do you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks to the panel. A great presentation. I have a question about the armies. Chris said that the DRV modeled its military on the PLA, on the Maoist-style army as a domestic political force. So the PAVN became a domestic political force. And I don't think the ARVN in the South was certainly never designed the same way. As Jay points out, there was an attempt by Q to at least have democratic structures, even though the military was politicized. But the ARVN certainly wasn't the PAVN in terms of politics. Am I perceiving that the way you were presenting that, or is that not an accurate characterization?
For me, the creation of the People's Army of Vietnam in 1950, it picked up on what had been going on before, which was not necessarily modeled strictly on the Sino-Soviet model. It was kind of a heterogeneous type of thing between 45 and 50, but certainly from 1950, it's a shift as along the lines that you said of politicization of the Army, the party controls, the cadres in the Army, et cetera. I would agree with what you said, David. Good to see you.
The ARVN sort of went through a series of changes over time. If you look at the original VNA, it was heavy infantry modeled on the French. The French leave, it's still modeled on the French. The Americans come in, they begin to reorient the South Vietnamese. And then people forget when Vietnamization happened, there was a huge change again. It was called the TONE of the ARVN. They added artillery, they added a lot of stuff, mobile transportation, and they reshifted it to add in armor, heavy weapons. So it was modeled by the end on the U.S. Army, and it was designed to fight a conventional war, which is what the war was about by that time. Right. So some shifts over time.
Thank you. Let's go to John Silverman, please. Please unmute yourself, John Silverman. Jerry Silverman.
Yes, Jerry. Right. It says I'm muted. No, but I'm not. You hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
My in-country experience was in the mid-60s, the 72 to 75, and then again in and out in the 90s. And so my perspective, for what it's worth, is more conceptual than it is substantive, because I have all three books here, and they're all exceptional and will add to my knowledge substantially. But I have a couple I wanted to deal with. I don't want to take too much of your time. So the conceptual stuff about Vietnam itself, I'll communicate through emails with all three of you. But let me deal with what I consider to be the simplest one, and that is the whole question of sovereignty, which is what Katie started with. I'm a political scientist, so I look at it perhaps differently, but the concept of sovereignty in most political science works, at least, have the two elements that have been mentioned in the responses and in the book, but don't have the third element, which from the legal perspective is critical, which is recognition as a sovereign state by other states, which, if there's a sufficient number of them, get you into international organizations like the UN and the World Bank. And
okay, so your question, please, Mr.
My question is, well, all right. I use the concept of parallel governance to describe the situation in Vietnam. That is, you have
your question. We have lots of people wanting to ask questions. I really need you to ask your question.
I'll send the emails. Never mind.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Lewis Cooper, please.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So, very quick question. Dr. Weiss seemed to present a more favorable picture of the Chu and Key years, at least in the early years of their regime, than I've encountered in the reading I've done about the pacification program, strategic Hamlet program, and so forth. And I was just wondering if the other two historians on the panel, Dr. Mchale and Dr. Goscha, would agree with Dr. Weiss' somewhat favorable, to my mind, description of the Q and Key regime.
Thank you. Sean, Chris? who'd like to take that on?
I would differ slightly. I mean, interesting enough, there's an essay that came out in, I think, the 90s by a person named Cao Van Loong, who was a Vietnamese historian, and he argued that the American period had indeed had a great impact on this land for the tiller. But his focus was on such things as mechanization of agriculture and things like that. And so my general sense is that we shouldn't give too much credit to Thieu when in fact the credit should go towards aid, which is targeted American aid, which is targeted towards actually changing South Vietnamese agriculture. So I would be less positive about that. And of course, there are many things about the Thieu regime which are not very positive, like tiger cages, for example.
Chris?
I would say I work on the period up to 54. I'm moving now into kind of the post-54 period. I work on the emergence of republicanism and constitutionalism over the long 19th century. And then I also am working increasingly on the associated state of Vietnam. So this second Vietnam that was officially born, I would say, in 1949, and which will eventually transform into the Republic of Vietnam, which will take over from the French. We could argue from late 1953 and 54, but certainly from 1954 on. So I'm very much in favor of the idea of re-exploring and taking seriously republicanism, non-communist republicanism, obviously the associated state and its avatars. And so I think, what Jay's done and Sean and others are doing on the Republic of Vietnam is to be welcome. Basically, let 100 flowers bloom is what I think.
Thank you. Let's go to John Martin. John Martin.
Yes, I just have a quick question. Did the American participation in this do anything other than prolong the carnage?
Well, that's a loaded question.
Well, certainly for me, I mean, I think I've argued elsewhere. I won't go into the details here, but the French Indochina War was a Franco-American war from 1950. I gave you the Sino-Vietnamese side of it, but the other half was, of course, that the Americans intervened indirectly to support the French as part of a wider, everyone knows this, wider containment policy against the Chinese. So it was a kind of a proxy war, if you like. You can agree or disagree, but certainly Chinese intervention indirectly behind Ho Chi Minh and American indirect intervention behind the French prolonged the war for reasons which the Chinese wanted to do it and for reasons which the Americans wanted to do it. And I think we need to do much more work on this global context. The three of us are in much more of a micro level here, but I think there's a whole global context that we need to revisit too. Coming out of it from the 19th century, the Americans, the Chinese, and the Soviets, what will become the Soviet Union in the 1920s, and how they will compete with each other in the mid 20th century, and my goodness, up until the day. So that's how I would handle that question as maybe a historian in international relations, which is my specialty.
Why don't we go to Susan Meeker? I'm trying to get as many questions in as we can. There's a long list. Susan Meeker, please unmute yourself.
This is a question for Christopher. In reading Lin Hang Win's book, Hanoi's War, she makes quite a point about the fact that Li Zhuang criticized Ho Chi Minh for selling out in 54 with the French. And I'm just wondering if you see a similar thing.
No, I don't see it.
You don't. So
I can elaborate if you want. I'm not calling into question Lin Hang, who I know and is a very good friend, but I fear that might be a post-54 thing going on. Lê Duẩn was in the South until 54. Maybe, I know of the documents that are involved in this, but I don't see it up until July of 54.
All right. Let's go to Monte McMurtry. Monte McMurtry. Sorry if I'm butchering your name.
Thank you very much, Monty McMurtry. My compliments to all three writers. And what each of you have illustrated is the profound insight in why antecedents matter, particularly the France Fanon reference. And it can be even used to the imbroglios that are happening today or what happened in Afghanistan. So my question to whoever would wish to respond is, how can academic historians provoke those who are making policy to understand, appreciate, and respect that history or historical antecedents do have a clarion to offer, not necessarily providing an absolute descriptive, but rather to provide insights in how to calibrate current day public policy in matters international? I thank all of you.
Thanks so much for this question. Who'd like to take this on?
Well, I live
Sean?
in Washington. I guess I will, and I find Washington is dominated by IR people who are who basically think in IR terms, and there has been, and for many political scientists, for some political scientists, there's a great interest in history. For many, there isn't all that much. And I think this is part of the problem. It's a disciplinary training sort of issue, which shapes the way they look at some of these issues. Not to slam an entire field, but this is often, I think, true. And it comes out in strange ways. And when we were hiring years ago a historian of Korea, a person who was working at George Washington University, said, "I can't believe," and we were thinking of hiring a historian. He said, "I can't believe people are interested in that shit." Those are his words. Looking at history before 1950 to understand the present, and I just think that's a mistake. I'll leave it there.
Let me perhaps. I know we're at the end of our time. I'm really curious about one question that I would love to ask to Chris, to Sean, and to Jay is, if you could put in one sentence, all of you have as we've said, dealt an academic career's worth of research in Vietnam and on Vietnam, and this discussion has shown the kind of levels that you're looking at the Vietnam Wars. If you could, in one sentence, say how your own view of the Vietnam Wars, First Indochina War, if you want, has changed over your career with this book, with your new book, in one sentence.
I can go first on this. So yeah. I would say that the one thing I would say is it is almost impossible to build a country and fight a war at the same time.
Thank you. Sean?
I've gone from a person who was nearly a pacifist getting out of college and actually very liberal. I still think of myself more that way, but in terms of my academic views, they've shifted. I'm actually more and more interested in, as my book I think shows, in those groups which were not convinced by, in a sense, the communist attempt to drive, in a sense, a movement. Interesting,
Chris.
I would say two things if I can cheat. Picking up on the last commentator there is, I think I realized that it's the France Fanon thing, is that historians, we do have to be able to find ways to write. We have to take advantage of these very kind offers that we have from people like you, Christian and Eric and others, to allow us to speak, and we have to try to convey our ideas in very clear ways and very limpid prose, if possible, because like the reader before, it's hard. It's hard to make an impact in ways which the commentator made a moment ago. The other thing, second thing which evolved from this work on the French Indochina War is I just never realized how violent this war was.
Thank you. We've had lots more questions. We've really just, I think, scratched the surface of these three wonderful big books. I'm so grateful to Katie to help us help steer us through this conversation. Thankful to Chris, Jay, and Sean for a great conversation. Of course, Eric, to whom I now turn this over for concluding remarks. Eric.
And my thanks as well to our authors, our moderator, and my colleague, Christian. That's it for today's session. But again, a reminder, we return for our final session of the spring season in but 2 days, this Wednesday, May 25th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, for a discussion of Michael Kazin's new book, What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party, with commentators Elizabeth Tandy Shermer of Loyola University and Henry Olson of The Washington Post. Till then, take care, be safe. We are adjourned.